Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this episode of True Crime with the Sarge. I'm your host, Joseph Giacalone. We have an unbelievable guest here today. We're going to introduce him in about a minute. Just wanted to go through a couple of quick things with you. Just please remember to subscribe and like the show because that helps us grow. We're closing in on 8,000 subscribers already, too, which is amazing. So thank you very much. If you're watching this live, I appreciate your time. And if you're watching this on the replay, too, thank you very much. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring in our guest. This is Tad Dibiase. He likes to be called Tobias, but you know what? He's wrong, right? So it's Dibiase. So
Exactly right.
so let's talk a little bit about who Tad is, right? He's a former U.S. attorney, right? AUSA
Correct.
from the District of Columbia. And he's also written a book, No Body Homicide Cases, which the link is in the show notes, including to his Twitter feed and a couple other items that you might find of interest. He spent most of his career doing homicide cases, including the second no body case in DC history. So, Tad, welcome to the show today. Thanks for coming on.
Great. Thanks for having me, Sarge. I appreciate it.
Yeah, this is kind of very exciting, right? Because we were just talking offline about how many of these no body cases are in the media now. And it seems kind of strange because you track this on your website, right? There's a link for this.
I do. So on my website, I keep track of all the cases that go to trial. And as of yesterday, we're at 598 since the early 1800s in the United States. So we're getting close to 600,
Wow.
which to me seems like a large number. But when you look at the number of homicide cases every year in the United States and cases that go to trial, 600 is still a really small percentage of that number. So it's still incredibly rare to have a no body homicide case go to trial.
Right, and the conviction rate on those cases are pretty high too, though, correct?
Yes, weirdly, even though it's hard to get the cases to trial, when you do successfully get one to trial, it's about an 87% conviction rate. And that compares to what I'd call sort of a regular murder case, a non nobody murder case, where it's about 71%. So it's significantly higher than a regular run of the mill murder case. And I think there's two reasons for that, Joe. I think the first reason is more than 50% of no body homicide cases are what I'd call domestic. Husband kills wife, boyfriend kills girlfriend, parent kills child. So in many of the cases right away, the suspect is very obvious because if you have a dead woman in her house, the husband is a likely, or the ex-husband is a likely suspect. The other reason why is prosecutors don't want to take a weak missing person slash no body murder case to trial because the defense is so obvious. If they can't even prove that the person is dead, how can they say that I'm the one who did it? So prosecutors really only take the strongest no body murder cases to trial. So I think that's a big reason why the percentage of the conviction is so much higher than a regular murder case.
And we were just discussing this, right? So you're saying like the bulk of these things happen in the last like 20, 25 years, right? We're seeing a lot of these no body cases. Do
Yes.
you have any theories on maybe why that might be happening?
So I think there's two big reasons, and like you and I were talking before we went on the air, over 50% of the cases that have gone to trial since the year 2000. So my cases, I track them back to the early 1800s, where you'd have ships come back to shore and the captain would be missing, and the crew would be like, "Oh, we don't know what happened to the captain." Well, of course, they tossed his ass overboard, and those were some of the early cases. But about 54% of the cases have occurred since the year 2000, so the last 24 or 25 years. And I think the two biggest reasons for that are number one, forensics have advanced so much. When I joined the US Attorney's Office in 1995, there were some DNA cases, but it wasn't incredibly common because it had really started in the late 1980s, early 1900s. By the time I left in 2007, there were a lot of DNA cases. And certainly since that time, the science has advanced incredibly. The second reason, and what I think is the bigger reason, is because of the amount of electronic trails we all leave behind, right? We all have one of these in our pocket, and it leaves an incredible trail of where we are at all times, how long we're there, who we might have called, who might have called us. all of these things. And of course, we live in a society where all of these things are tracked. If I get money out of an ATM, if I use my credit card somewhere, if I drive through a toll, Easy Pass clicks on it. So all of these things that didn't exist 30 years ago, let alone 50 years ago, make it so much easier for police and prosecutors to say, yeah, that guy's not just missing, he's actually dead because he has not communicated on any format. No one has heard from him. His phone is dead. It's not, or it's going off in the same area. All of those things lead to a greater ability for the police to quickly say they're not just missing; they're likely dead.
Right, and then we are going to get into some recent cases, but when you brought that up, I've also this thought about the video surveillance that we saw, like I say, in Michelle Tracona's case with Jennifer Dulos. We will get into that, but yeah, that's adding another layer onto the
Absolutely.
prosecutors.
Yep.
So let's get into the book, right? So you have no body homicide cases, and you talk about the two prongs of an investigation when you're dealing with one of these cases. Can you tell us what those prongs are, and then we'll get into some of that those steps.
Sure. So the first prong is you have to prove the person is dead because in an ordinary murder case, of course, you just put on, if you're a prosecutor, you put on a forensic pathologist, medical examiner, coroner, depending on your jurisdiction. And that person testifies, yeah, I examined the body. Clearly they were dead. And then the person talks about how they died, when they died, and where they died. In a no body murder case, you don't have any of that. You never put on a forensic pathologist or anybody because you don't have the body. So the very first challenge is I've got to prove this person is dead. And the question becomes, how do you do that? Well, it requires putting on an enormous amount of evidence because you're going to have to put on people who knew the victim and to say, yeah, I haven't talked to her in 6 years or I haven't talked to her in 6 months, whatever it is. And then you have to put on the physical evidence that manifests someone is alive. They never checked in at work. Their cell phone never had any outgoing calls to it. There was no more text. They didn't do anything on Facebook or Instagram. You have to build all of these things to convince 12 people in a jury that this person is not missing. They're actually dead. Because if they were missing, there would be some indication that they would be alive or that they moved somewhere else. Maybe we have a plane ticket. Maybe we can look at toll records. Maybe we can look at work records or Social Security. If they were withdrawing from Social Security, they didn't withdraw anything from their bank account. So that's the first step that you don't have in an ordinary murder case. The second step is the same as a regular murder case, which is now that I've proven to you this person is deceased, I got to prove to you that that guy sitting over there in that defendant's chair is the one who did it. So these two prongs differentiate a no body murder case from every other type of crime, let alone every other type of murder.
Right, and I was looking at the research that you're doing on there, and it's still predominantly, overwhelmingly men that are responsible for these cases.
Yes, 91% of the defendants in no body murder cases are men. And I don't remember the exact percentage of women that are the victims, but it's also pretty high. I think it's close to 60%. Um, and that makes sense when you consider so many of these cases are domestic cases. And I think the reason a lot of the cases are domestic is the example I always give is if I'm a burglar and I break into someone's house during the day when I think no one is home, and then all of a sudden the homeowner comes around the corner and I'm like, oh shit, there's the homeowner, and I shoot and kill the person. The last thing I am going to do is I'm not going to hang around and try and get rid of the body, right? I'm going to get the hell out of the house as quickly as possible because no one is going to think I am the suspect. But if I'm at home with my wife and I kill my wife, I've got to get rid of that body because everyone is going to suspect me. So I've got to take the chance to try and cover it up and get rid of those the tracks or the evidence that I've left behind. And I think that's really the reason for a lot of that.
Right, and just for the heads up to everybody out there, right? You're the first person we're looking at anyway, even if you do clean up the crime scene. So pretty
Exactly.
much,
There's
yeah,
usually a
tag, you're it.
there used to be a shirt that says the husband did it, and unfortunately that's often right. Although as I like to instruct investigators when I teach the class that I teach, I like to tell them don't go on a hypothesis, go on the evidence, and you can use the hypothesis of typically in any murder case, the murderer is someone known to the victim But that's not always the case. So you have to be careful about following the evidence, not following a theory.
Right. So in the book, you're talking about the TV show, the first 48, and how it's kind of important. We used to refer to it as the golden hour, even right, that first hour of
Yes.
the investigation. How really important is that to a case, specifically when you have no body?
I think it's really important because one of the problems with a nobody murder case is you often, as an investigator, you don't know when the murder occurred, right? If someone's been missing for any significant period of time, it's usually very difficult to pinpoint exactly when they left. You have some cases where you know right away. Someone reports, hey, this person is missing. They were supposed to meet me at X time. I haven't heard from them since X time. That's very important. But in a lot of no bodies, you don't have that. You simply have, well, I haven't heard from her in a week, or I haven't seen her in 6 months. That becomes much harder. So you don't even know when the first 48 hours is, which is challenge number one. And in the cases where you do know, hey, this person just disappeared, that's not like them. I was supposed to meet them at this, date, time, and place. That first 48 hours is the most critical time because then you can find out, well, who's the last people to see her. We can ping her cell phone. We can see where her cell phone is because, as you know, cell phone tower records don't last very long. So if you don't get them right away, you really can be kind of behind the eight ball. So there is something to the fact of getting that information in the first 48 hours becomes crucial.
Right. So yeah, generally these things happen where the husband or whomever calls the police, say my wife hasn't come home from work, right, or has she went out to the store and she hasn't come back yet, and they invite law enforcement in, and they have to take the report, right? So what are some of the things that law enforcement should be looking for when they're trying to get this information from the reporter, right, who might be your suspect?
One of the things I found that was interesting in doing my research is there are many missing people per year. And I don't remember the exact stat. I want to say it's like 50,000 missing people every year. The vast majority of whom are found and returned, many of them, of course, within 48 hours. Often people go disappearing. But of the people who are long term missing people, the only I'm sorry, of all the missing people, only 12% are adult females. So that is very rare. So if you're starting off with our typical victim profile, which is an adult female, only 12% of them go missing. So you right away say, is it realistic that this person who's an adult female would go missing? And the answer is no, it's not, because the people who go missing are teenagers, young adults. Interestingly, I would have thought a lot of um, young adult females would go missing, but there's actually many more males who go missing. So
Hmm.
as an investigator, you have to look at the victim and say, how likely is it that this person is just went missing because they ran away or they're tired of life or maybe they're in the drug trade or something? And how likely is it that something more nefarious happened? And the questions you can ask are, has this person ever gone missing before? What is going on in this person's life that may have led to them being missing? Do they have responsibilities that it seems unlikely that person would be missing? Number one being, do they have children? Most of the time, we want to think mothers aren't going to go disappearing and leave their children behind. Was she someone who worked and was always at work and told people when she was at work? Was she someone who had regular communications with her family and now that has stopped? So, those are the things you're looking for because most of the time when someone goes missing, obviously they come back. So you can't treat every missing person as a homicide case, where you'll just be running around like a chicken with your head cut off because you'll constantly be treating it as a homicide. But what you need to do is to say, what scenario is it that this person is more likely to be perhaps murdered than just missing?
Right. So one of the questions that I used to ask was because you know what, as a cop, you go into these things and you kind of like you listening to things. I used to ask is did she leave her pocketbook behind? Did she leave certain like today? Well, because now I mean I'm old too now, so but now you would ask did she leave her cell phone behind, right? Or car keys? I
Yes.
mean these are the kind of things that people just don't leave behind.
Absolutely. That's a really good point, Joe. And that's what I counsel when I talk to investigators, particularly crime scene search people, is look to see what's missing, but also look to see what's present. Because if you see something present, such as wallet, maybe medication is another
Yep.
big one, because if someone's diabetic, they're not going to leave medication behind. A cell phone is an obvious one. A treasured piece of jewelry. If those things are left behind, that lends an air of, I doubt this person left voluntarily. It's much more likely that they left because something nefarious happened. And then, of course, what's missing? What is gone? If their pocketbook is gone, if their cell phone is gone, the good news is if their cell phone is missing, there's a greater chance that you're going to be able to track that cell phone and maybe find out where the cell phone is. And typically that can at least lead to some clues as to where the cell phone was last, if it's still being used, who called, to, from, all that. That's going to give you a better indication of perhaps where the missing person is.
Right. Yeah. And if they stop using their social media when they're taking photos every day, on Instagram or what have you, and then all of a sudden that
Right.
stops, right? Another big warning sign there. So we're actually talking about two different things, not two different things. We're talking about two things that I want to make sure we cover. One's victimology, and the other one is there's search warrant issues sometimes, right? Because we know that we're victimized by someone we know most of the time. This person calls up and says, "My wife hasn't come home." Tell me that whole tenuous kind of thing about, do when will a search warrant be necessary for something like
Sure.
this?
That's a really good point. And one of the things I try and train on is it's really important to get a search warrant, because what you don't want to have is you don't want to have anything thrown out because you violated someone's Fourth Amendment right. And when you have a search warrant, you're almost bulletproof in terms of your ability to get whatever you found from that search warrant into court. And you know this, Joe, from being a cop, that if I got a search warrant, it's really hard for the defense to throw out that search warrant unless there's something that is so incredibly incorrect and basically a lie in the search warrant. But otherwise, once a judge signs off on it, any law enforcement has the right to then go search for what it says I'm going to be looking for, because the idea is, hey, this neutral and detached magistrate or judge looked at it and said, yes, you can sign off and do that. Now, there are some exceptions. If I'm looking in the victim's house, I probably am going to be okay with getting the consent of either anyone else who lives in the house, even if it's the husband. Um, but if I have an understanding that the victim lived one place and my suspect lived in another place, while I may be okay going into the victim's house with a search without a search warrant, I definitely am not going in the suspect's house without a search warrant unless that person consents. And if they do consent, I want that either in writing or I wanted it recorded on a body camera or something, because I don't want there to be any doubt at trial that not only did this person consent to the search, but that it was completely voluntary, the consent that was given, because you'd be amazed at the stories people make up at trial and say, "Oh, I didn't volunteer, or I was high out of my mind, or I was drunk, or the
Yeah.
cops forced me to do it." You don't want to have that. So it's really important to get that search warrant. And then Joe, you touched on victimology, which is really critical in these cases, particularly in the early stages, because you want to figure out who is this person who is missing and why are they missing, and meaning, is it likely that they're missing, or is it more likely that something nefarious happened to them? And obviously you can have people in different situations. You can have a suburban housewife who's killed, we believe, in her home, because obviously we haven't found the body, or you could have someone in the maybe a sex worker. Those people are in completely different milieus of where your victim, I'm sorry, where your suspects are going to be coming from. And that's not to say that you treat those cases any differently, because they're both important cases and they must be treated the same. But your pool of suspects is obviously much larger and unknown in a sex worker scenario than it is in a suburban housewife who maybe has kids and works or doesn't work, works out of the home. Those are just going to be two completely different pools of suspects that you're looking at.
Right. So we're trying to get to know who the victim is, right? Who their friends are, where they work, where they hang out, where they get their hair done, right? Their nails done. When
Yes.
you have a missing female, right? These are kind of things where they're on a schedule, where every week they get this done. And when that breaks, right, this is a red flag or a warning sign for investigators.
Absolutely. And the importance of that is, I find in a lot of these cases, you really have to go outside the kind of first circle of people. And I liken it to when you throw a stone in the water, right? You get these concentric rings that come out. And in a nobody murder case, you're going to go really far out in those rings. In a missing person case, you might hit the first or second ring, but in a nobody murder case, you got to go really far out there because you raised a good point, right? A lot of women get their hair done, get their fingernails done, and what do they do while they're there? They talk, and they talk to their hairdresser. And that's not something that would leap to mind to most people. But then you go talk to the hairdresser, and she says, "Oh yeah, by the way, she told me she was having an affair
Mhm.
and blah blah blah." And then you start to learn about someone that the family had no idea about, but you start to learn, oh wait a second, there's this other guy out here. It's maybe not just the husband. That's really critical to get to know the victim, get to know the friends, and all of those connections.
Right. And the reason why I brought that up is from personal experience where you talk to the husband and everything's fine. Everything's great. We have a great relationship. And then you track down the nail salon person or the hairdresser and they tell you, oh my God, she tells me how a horror show he was and how he would beat her and this and that. And then you start going through the domestic violence reports and all of a sudden you start seeing things, right? So you see
Yep.
those inconsistencies in the stories, and it's really important that investigators really take a deep dive into even places like we've already recommended, right? That are kind of like you don't think of.
Yes, absolutely, and I use it too to talk to people about looking at someone's phone. And again, get a search warrant for the phone. Never make the mistake of I'm going to pick up the phone. I'm going to start scrolling through because it's not locked, or I know I how to get it unlocked because the son knows the passcode. You want to get a search warrant, but when you start going through the phone and start going through the apps, you realize, oh my God, this person is on Tinder, and here they are married. I thought seemingly happy, all of that. That's going to be the type of information that you need to find out that you're not going to get from any other source. A friend may have no idea that she was on Tinder or whatever, a dating app. And that's going to lead you potentially in a whole different direction if you find out, oh, she's meeting all these different people.
Right, which leads into additional search warrants, right? So it's not just the phone, but now you're going to get search warrants and subpoenas for all these different apps that you're going to need too, and get that data because that could
Absolutely.
lead
I
into.
was just finishing up working on a case out of Illinois, and they went got search warrants for the phone. And when you start drilling into it, you have to get them, as you said, all these different apps. You have to get ones for the text messages, one for the cell tower location, ones for the phone calls themselves. It's a lot of work getting all these search warrants, and it can be overwhelming, especially when you're talking about cell phone records when you're looking at how many calls people make and it shows text and differentiating what's a text, what's a call. How do you prioritize that? How do you look at this wealth of information and figure out what's the one that I want to start with to try and figure out who she was having communications with?
Right, and then you included a copy of a kind of search warrant that they can use in order to pick
Yes.
out some of these things, right?
Yeah, in the
So
back of the latest edition, that was one thing from the first edition, which came out in November of 2014, and this one came out in November of 2023. So what's that, almost 10 years later? That was one of the questions I got a lot is, could you help us draft a search warrant? Sometimes an arrest warrant, sometimes a search warrant. So I decided to put kind of a model search slash arrest warrant in there because there were so many questions about, well, how do I get it? And part of the problem was a lot of the people who are working on these cases know what is prevalent in nobody murder cases, but didn't necessarily have a way to convey it in a search warrant. And so, what I tried to do is put things in there to say, look, I've received training on nobody murder cases, hopefully from me or from someone else. But that training tells me the following things: look for evidence of cleaning up, look for if you're going to search for a body, look for places well known to the defendant. Some of the things we talk about in the book that point to commonalities that you see in no body murder cases that you don't necessarily see in a regular murder case. In a regular murder case, you probably don't see any evidence of cleaning up because it's like, well, the body's just there in the street. Who the hell's going to clean that up? But in a no body murder case, you see those things much more commonly.
well, that's actually a good segue now too, because let's talk a little bit about Anna Walsh case, right? Because there is a DC connection to this case, but just what you explained, right? There's some evidence in the home that they find that something happened in the basement,
Yes.
and then the video surveillance of him doing stuff, and then we're going to talk about his Google searches too, right now,
Yeah.
how important that is, right? So let's dive into the Anna Walsh case because he's got appearances coming up, and that trial hasn't started yet.
Yeah,
So,
so so I'll just start. I mean, the Anna Walsh case is basically a woman who was a realtor in New York. I think she was at the time she was visiting in Massachusetts, if I'm not mistaken,
mhm,
and then disappeared on January 1st, basically after New Year's Eve party. Disappears. Husband tells a story about her flying back. It doesn't really make sense because it was initially, yeah, she missed her flight or she wanted to move up the flight time. It was a strange flight time. It was very early in the morning after New Year's Eve, which of course a lot of people celebrating New Year's Eve, the last thing you want to do is catch like a 7 a.m. flight and leave your house at 3 in the morning after you've maybe been drinking. But then, of course, and that story started to fall apart because there didn't seem to be any indication that she had taken a flight. And then come to find out, he'd gotten, I believe it was $450 worth of cleaning supplies at Home Depot. Well, that's one of the things that when I've looked at no body murder cases now for almost 20 years, that is a red flag. You see that so commonly. All of a sudden, buying, $450 of cleaning fluids, cleaning supplies is a hell of a lot. He's buying bleach and all these different things.
yep.
That's a real indication right there. And then what I think is probably the most damning, you mentioned it, Sarge, is his Google searches, right? And actually, I wrote them down because they're so, and I'll be frank, they're so incredibly stupid that you could actually search for these things and then think no one's going to find them. He wrote down how long before a body starts to smell, dismemberment in the best ways to dispose of a body, can you be charged with murder without a body? Those were three of his searches, which of
Yeah.
course are incredibly damning. And then, as we know now, Brian Walsh also had a very significant problem with some stolen artwork and fraudulent artwork that he just got sentenced for that. I think a week ago, he got something like 37 months on this federal art work beef. And his case is going to trial, so he's presumed innocent. But in the kind of pantheon of no body murder cases, this would be considered a very strong case because of the searches, because of the story that turned out not to be true, because of the buying of the cleaning items. And another thing you see a lot in no body murder cases that I've talked about is when the suspect tells a provable lie. And this is one thing I lecture about when I talk to law enforcement, because one of the problems with those of us who've been in law enforcement for a long time is we're very used to people lying to us, right? And I remember years ago, I have two daughters who are grown up now, but when they were little, I came home one day and they said, Daddy, what did you do at work today? And I said, Well, girls, I sat at my desk in my office and detectives brought in people to me who just lied to my face all day long, right? Because that's what happens in DC in particular. Nobody saw anything. And if something happened, I happened to be looking the other way. And oh, when I saw the guy, but I don't know who he is. So you just get people who lie. And in law enforcement, we get very jaded by that and we get very used to it. And it's sort of the part of doing business, right? You sort through the lies and eventually you get the truth. But to a jury, if you have someone who is a suspect in a no body murder case, particularly if they have a relationship with the victim, to catch them in a lie is incredibly damning, right? Because most people think if a husband is married to a wife and the wife goes missing, the husband, unless he's somehow involved in the murder, would have absolutely no reason to lie ever about anything, right? He'd only want to tell the truth to help the investigators find that person who did that to his wife. So when you start catching them in lies, let alone when you can prove 4, 5, 6 lies that they've told, which often happens in no body murder cases, that is very damning to a jury. And it's something I think we in law enforcement don't recognize enough because we're so used to it. But when you tell a civilian jury, hey, this guy told this lie and this lie and this lie, it is incredibly damning. And it's very common in a no body murder case to start telling lies.
Right. Yeah. I mean, when you look at this Brian Walsh guy too, I mean, he used his, I think his son's iPad to do this too, right? So yeah, I
Yes.
doubt some 10-year-old is or 11-year-old is doing this thing. Talk about red flags. I tell my students all the time, so many red flags, it looks like China. I mean,
Yeah,
that's the
exactly.
kind of thing that like it screams right at you, right? I mean, just hits you
Yes.
right in the forehead.
Yep.
And I think investigators picked. I think they have some video surveillance of him going to these recycling sites and
Yes.
dropping off stuff, which will when we get into the Jennifer
Doulos,
Dulos case, yeah, I
same
mean,
thing.
talk about
Yeah, it's
home
funny when
run.
I first started reading about the Brian Walsh case, I said to myself, it's like he read my book and did everything you're not supposed to do. Like he was trying to compile the worst nobody murder defense ever by doing all of these things because it really is almost comical when you start thinking about a lot of the things I talk about in my book. He's doing all of them. And that's why I do think ultimately he is going to be convicted.
Yes, because I've written an investigation book myself, but I'm going to ask you this question because I get this question asked all the time. Do you think you're creating better criminals by writing books like this?
Yeah, I've heard that. And I do worry about that sometimes. And when I teach my classes, I only teach to police and prosecutors. I don't sort of open it to the general public. Um, but I think it's very hard in the moment, which a lot of these cases are, because they're domestic. They usually involve two people who were in some type of relationship, and the murder, happens in the moment, in the heat of the moment. First degree convictions for no body murder cases are not incredibly prevalent, and death penalties are even smaller. There's probably only about 35 that have been death penalties. So most of them are what we think of second degree murder, manslaughter. And so I do think it's harder unless you read the book beforehand and consciously said, this is what I'm going to try and do to get away with this murder. And I do, I worry about that a little, but I also think it is way more important, given the number of missing persons cases that we have that are unsolved, to say, use this book, detectives, to go back on your old cold cases, like you had mentioned, and use these techniques to see if you can solve those cases. I'm sure there is probably someone somewhere who read my book and said, oh, now I got away with it, never to be caught again. But I also like to say to people who piss me off, hey, don't piss me off because I do know how to get away with this type of murder.
I was asked that question it was a Fox News interview, it was a live interview, and they asked me, but we were talking about the Brian Kohlberger case. He was a criminal
Yes.
justice PhD student, and are you worried about this? I'm like, he's the guy wearing the orange jumpsuit, so I'm not really too worried about this at
Right.
this point.
He wasn't
You
so
know,
good at it either.
yeah.
It's hard, and of course, when you are disposing of a body, it's a very difficult thing to do, right? And that's why a lot of no body murders occur inside the home, because the last thing I'm going to do is, if I'm outside, is try and cut up a body, chop it up, however you use a chainsaw. It's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to do inside a home and not leave behind a trace. So one of the things I tell detectives, particularly crime scene techs, is take out the drains, right? Because if you are trying to do that, you're going to try and wash it down the bathtub drain, the sink drain, the toilet. Take the drains out. You've got to get that because you're going to get evidence. And it's very difficult to do this very, very cleanly.
Yep, absolutely. It's part of even like in, for instance, New York City, you have the trap in the basement that you have to do, or the laundry chutes, and all the
Yes.
different things that you do in those apartment buildings. So yeah, and then in the book, so actually we're on the same sort of topic here. You're basically saying for the investigators, there's basically two things you need to hone in on when you have a missing body case in regards to the perpetrator, to start looking for locations where this person might ultimately be. Did we talk about those?
Yes. So one of the things I've discovered is all the cases that I have listed went to trial with no body. The body was not discovered. But during a lot of those cases, there is discussion about what happened to the body. And there are other cases where, after the person is convicted, the defendant, in order to win himself some sort of benefit, maybe take the death penalty off the table, take life without the possibility of parole, he will reveal where the body is. He will lead the police to the body. So we have a number of these cases where we know where the bodies are, and what One of my dear daughters did. Actually, both of them have worked on it over the years. They did an Excel spreadsheet that said when we knew where the body was disposed of, where was it disposed of? And the number one place was burial. The number two place was disposing it in a body of water. And I think the number three was dumpster. And what we were discovering when we're looking at this is the body is almost always disposed of in a place familiar to the suspect. And it makes sense if you think about it, because if you have a body, you don't want to go to some strange place that you're not familiar with and try and get rid of it, right? I'm not going to go on some strange property and start digging a hole in the middle of the night when all of a sudden a farmer comes with a shotgun and basically says, "What are you doing here, boy?" That's a bad look, to say the least. So what we've found is they use places familiar to them. They use maybe where they went fishing, maybe where a swimming hole, maybe a relative's property. There are many times where a body's been found on, this was my grandmother's vacant farm. So all of those things. So when you're figuring out where to look for a body, which you must do, particularly depending on the timing. Now, if you're inheriting a cold case 20 years old, I probably wouldn't spend a lot of time looking for a body. But if I'm inheriting or I'm working on a case that's only 2 years old, you're going to need to spend time looking for a body, because as long as I've been doing this and I think helping people solve these cases, it is always, always, always better to have the body than not to have the body, because you can get even a body that's been, disposed of for a long time. You can still get helpful evidence. It's rare to get nothing helpful from the body. If you can identify it and tie it to your victim, you probably have enough to get some helpful evidence. So you want to look for the body. And so you have to start thinking, put yourself, we talked about victimology, and this is sort of suspectology. Put yourself in this suspect's shoes. Where would he or she rarely get rid of a body? What would they do to get rid of that body? What's the radius of the area that I need to think about? And that can be important if you have a case where the timing is very close to when the person went missing to the police found about it, and then you're already in contact with your suspect, because okay, if this murder happened in Dallas, I know the body's likely not buried in Minnesota. It's just too far. It's somewhere within the Dallas Fort Worth area, because this person hasn't had that much time to get rid of the body. And be aware of, occasionally someone will murder someone, keep them in one place, and then move them to another location. So they may be in the house temporarily, and then they realize, well, shit, if they find this body in the house, I'm sunk. So I got to move it. And they move it somewhere else. So then you've got some indication in the house, you've got some indication in whatever vehicle was used to transport the person, and then of course you've got the new location, which is why I'm actually now, I used to be a skeptic, but I'm now a very big believer in cadaver dogs, because I do think they're a powerful tool when they can come in a house or a location and say, there was something here. The dog is giving an indication in a crawl space in a basement. That's, like you said, Joe, red flag number one, because those dogs really are skilled at detecting human scent and differentiating human scent from animal scent.
Oh yeah, I'll personally endorse cadaver dogs in some of the cases we had in cold case. But it's almost as if, like, when we were talking about this, even though we were doing some general talk, it sounds like the Harmony Montgomery case, like a textbook example of it, right? So she's in the apartment that they were living in, right? They had her
Yes,
up in the ceiling and the roof. So, this is a clue for investigators. This is something that they need to look at. There's a good possibility that the victim might be in that house still. And,
yes.
once again, search warrant issues need to be done. So let's
It,
talk
it's a
about
really
this.
good it's a really good point, Joe, because in the Harmony Montgomery case, they said they moved her. She was in a cooler, I think, at one point,
Mhm.
and they moved her when they moved out of the location. So if you're just a detective, investigator, crime scene person going around and looking in the house, they may have been able to do enough of a cleanup that you couldn't make any detection that something was there. You bring in a cadaver dog, and the cadaver dog is hitting in a certain location or in a ceiling. That's really powerful evidence to say, hold on, we got to do a better search now. We got to bring in alternate light sources, something that's going to, the spray you put on the wall, those types of things to find blood and DNA. That's the type of thing where it is powerful to say something was here. And now I got to figure out where they moved it to. Well, what would they have used to move it? Did they have access to cars? They have access to friends' cars? Those cars I got to find. And that's the difference a cadaver dog makes. Even if the cadaver dog doesn't find the body, the fact that they're indicating makes you stop and say, something happened here. This dog is indicating here for a reason.
Right, and then that's a search warrant issue too, right? So if you brought the
Yes,
dog into the house, I mean that is definitely a search. I wouldn't ask for consent on that one. Get the search warrant. I mean,
I
because like I
agree.
said, you don't want to
Absolutely.
explain. When in doubt, fill it out was my motto. And
Yep.
even though
And
it
that's
didn't make me
100%
popular,
true. Yep, it's
it,
100% true. It takes a little longer, but most search warrants, as you know, are granted. Most of the time, the judges say yes. I don't know what the percentage is, but in my career, it was remarkably rare when the your detective came back to you and said, "You're not gonna believe this. They didn't sign it." I can think of maybe once or twice that happened to me. Most of the time, you have a pretty good basis, and that's why building that victimology is good early on, because then you're saying to the judge, hey, judge, this woman is missing, never gone missing before, didn't miss work without telling someone, left this behind, left this behind. All of those things lead us to conclude that she's not just missing, she's dead. Judge is going to sign off on that and say, yeah, you need to get in the house, and yeah, use a cadaver dog.
right, and I think this is like an example where we can look at, because she's 5 years old, right? She's been missing for a while. It looks like a couple of agencies dropped the ball on this, right? I mean, where she is, who she's been given to, and that kind of thing. That's for another show. But from the investigative standpoint, there's another case where there's a young child missing. Bringing in a cadaver dog into the house or the apartment might be an option for you because we've already seen it happen now for sure,
Yeah,
and deal with it that way.
absolutely. And you raised a couple of good points, Joe. First, in the Harmony Montgomery case, she was reported missing in, I think, December of 2021, but they really believe she may have been murdered 2 years earlier. So, of course, the question is, how could no one have kept track of this child? And the difficulty, the kind of particular difficulty with a no-body child case, is the child is unfortunately much easier to dispose of. They're much smaller. The parents have much greater control over what happens to that child. Now, the flip side of that is, it is highly unlikely a child is going to walk away, particularly in this case. I think she was 5 years old.
Yeah.
It's highly unlikely she's going to walk away for any particular time. You really, your two choices are the child was kidnapped or the parents did something to her. And of course, if the child was kidnapped and they're only reporting it 2 years later, that's not a great look for the parents, obviously. So you have that kind of dichotomy of easier to dispose of, but much more guilty looking if you're a parent and you can't explain what happened to the child. But of course, you have people in that child's life who didn't intervene and say, yeah, we've never saw this child anymore. And that's the sad part about a child case, is you usually have others along the way who could have maybe have stopped it, or at least reported it much earlier.
Right, yeah, this is not like, oh, my wife left and she's working at a car wash in Seattle now, and
Right.
that kind of. I mean, you have a 5-year-old, she can't take care of herself, she can't do any of that
Nope.
stuff. So, unfortunately, the investigators were behind the 8 ball because this was taking a long period of time before they were, told that she was actually missing, and that's part of the problem that you're dealing with here. Just wanted to get a quick second out here. Hope Afia, who generously donated a membership. Thank you very much, Hope. I appreciate that. So yeah, I mean, we know that he gets the weird part of this thing, right? He rents a U-Haul and he travels pretty far. So
Yes.
which kind of like, I've been sitting there looking at this now for a while, and then all of a sudden when you just said dawned on me, right? Places he was familiar with, right? So now I think they need to go back and look about why he took that hour trip. And see if did he grow up there, or did he, spend time on a ranch or what have you. So that's actually an interesting little tidbit there.
Yeah, and what you can do is, when you and I were little, because I think we're probably close to contemporaries, you had the little compass, with a pencil in
Mhm.
one end, a little stick in the other, and you draw a circle. You draw a hour circle. How far could I drive in an hour? Look at that circle and start saying, do I know of any area that he's familiar with? Like you said, grew up as a kid. Maybe he worked there. Maybe he drove through on his way to work every day. When you drive through these locations, that we all do on our commute, we get familiar with the locations, right? I drive by certain areas in Washington, D.C. every day when I go to work. And I often think, oh, that'd be a good place to get rid of a body in Rock Creek Park, right? Where there was a body found, a very famous one. um, in a case here that wasn't a no body case, but it was someone who was missing for quite a long time, and then ultimately was there was a trial for that. So you start thinking along those lines of, if I'm that suspect, where would I go? What would I do? What place am I familiar with?
Right, like did he go to camp there? I mean, there could be a million things that
Yes,
people did when they were kids or adults, and you take a look at it and say, but at least zone in on that kind of thing. Because we're talking about, he was up in New Hampshire and he went down into Massachusetts, I believe, for that hour or something trip.
yes.
And it's just interesting to see what ties that is, and I think I don't know. Did you see the press conference that the police chief had afterwards?
No, I did not.
Okay. Well, yeah, just to quickly sum it up, he actually kind of looked like he gave the green light to the public to help. He says, when the weather gets warmer and the snow dissipates, maybe we can have, maybe we get some luck finding it. It was almost as if he was telling the people, like, listen, all in that area when you're out in your walks around looking for things, but there's probably very little left, right? I mean, we're looking at for maybe bones and that kind of thing because there's
Yeah,
no
because
flesh. We know that it's
yeah,
too
if it's
low.
2019 now or then when it happened, and and I do think it depends a lot on the location. If I have someone in Florida telling me they have someone who went missing 10 years ago, I'm like, you're probably not going to want to spend time looking for the body. The temperature in Florida, bodies disintegrate, particularly if they're outside in the water somewhere. But if it's someone in Minnesota and it's been 4 or 5 years, yeah, maybe you want to make a little bit more of an effort because the temperature is more favorable to preserving a body. The winters are cold and the summers aren't super, super hot, although that's unfortunately starting to change all over the earth. Everywhere is getting kind of hot now. But you do have to make kind of a cost benefit of, do I look? What is important in any case, if you do look, is you are very methodical and meticulous about writing down where you look so that you don't repeat yourself. And I do think inviting members of the public is a good idea. It enables people who want to be helpful, but you got to make sure you're keeping track of where they look. You got to make sure you instruct them carefully how to do a grid search, how to keep track of where you search, because in the case I was talking about in DC, they had the police do a search for Chandra Levy, who's the missing girl, and they ended up later finding the body maybe 50 feet off of where the police cadets had gone and searched. They just didn't search far enough. So those types of things, you want to make sure you're really organized in how you're doing that search and how you're keeping track of it.
Right, and I think you just brought up a great point too. It's this way, if they decide to do this right, where they have, hope the local police chiefs try to get some organization, all right, who these people are, get some ID, right? Because we've seen some crazy stuff where people inject themselves
Absolutely.
into the investigation and the search, quote unquote, looking for things. I mean, we
Yeah, and let
know,
me uh, let me
yeah,
touch on that, Joe, because you raise a really good point. Of a lot of these people who commit these crimes, particularly domestic ones, are very controlling people. This is why there's typically often prior domestic abuse. One of the things I talk about when I teach the class is setting up social media to be helpful. You can set up a Facebook page, an Instagram page. Very helpful, gets the word out to people about the case. But it's also very helpful for detectives because, okay, now I can go behind the scenes with a subpoena and see who's looking at this, who comes multiple times to look and see what's happening on this Facebook page. Very, very good way to start saying, this is odd. This guy keeps coming back to look at what's going on with the Facebook page, what's going on with the Instagram. Maybe then you get information about them and then you're able to subpoena their computer information. And all of a sudden you find out they're doing Google searches on the case. Now, someone like me, I'm doing a lot of Google searches on a lot of cases, but if you find this person is focusing on a particular case, that can be damning.
right. I'm sure if they dumped our search records, we'd be in
Yeah,
trouble too, just from just from looking at
lock
stuff.
lock me up right now. Done.
Just to look at it. But it's an important part that we know who's helping out and who's doing what. Because if they stumble upon something that turns out to be a victim or some sort of evidence and it's not handled properly, things can get
Absolutely.
really, kind of lost. You're doing something good, but then you kind of mess things up in that respect. But it's an important aspect for law enforcement to remember to try to get everybody together and like you said, even maybe even use social media and say, listen, we're going to do search parties on such and such
Yes.
a weekend. Come out, but you have to register at this corner or the entrance of the park. Bring your identification, and also that keeps other people out too, right? When you have to identify yourself to do this,
Yes.
you'll keep
It's
other
a great
people.
it's a great point because you're basically leveraging people who want to be helpful but not harming the case, because that's the worst case. If somebody finds something and they say, "Oh, I picked it up and I brought it back to the police. Here you go," without a record of where they found it, what it looked like when they found it, and of course, now they've contaminated it. You got to be very careful about that.
Right. Or the allegation will be they brought something with them and then
Right.
put it out there and
Plopped
did
it
all that
there.
stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's really important. I never experienced that because we never really did that. New York City doesn't have, besides Central Park, we really don't have these big, expansive places where
Hmm.
you can hide things in that respect. It was more like you said before, dumpsters, that kind of stuff, disposing it burying it out in the dunes out in Brooklyn when they used to have them. Right now it's all built up. But when I was a cop, we had still had streets in the city that were dirt roads. People don't
Right.
understand that,
Yeah,
you
and
know.
the dumpster you mentioned, that's become very popular, and it's probably the fastest rising way to get rid of a body. In the case that I tried in DC, that's the suspect ultimately confessed to disposing it in a dumpster behind a popular restaurant, and we were never able to prove that was true or not. But I think in a lot of ways it makes sense because this was a high volume restaurant. They were throwing out multiple heavy black bags of trash, and he said he put the body into a black bag, threw it out in this dumpster. And obviously, in a place like New York City, that's a very popular way to get rid of something because the amount of trash in New York and then to try and search a landfill becomes incredibly difficult. And that's a whole different area of searching landfills. It's very dangerous to search a landfill. A lot of people don't know that because when you have all the garbage starting to break down, it release gases, methane gas, and others that can be very deadly. It's very dangerous for detectives and officers to do a search of a landfill.
Yep. Yeah. And if you've ever seen these landfills, they have these huge pipes that are coming out of the ground just for those to release that methane gas because,
Yes,
and there's signs, no smoking and no this, no that,
right.
because it could be, like I said, really dangerous. But I tell you something, New York City sanitation keeps pretty good records, right? So you can kind of
Yes,
narrow it down to certain sections. But this is another great segue right into the last couple minutes that we have left, Jennifer Dulos, right? Because we
yes,
see the suspects, right? Because we have one guy who, he went out the coward's way, right, and killed
yep.
himself after he gets arrested. But you see these guys on video go into different trash cans throughout Hartford, I believe it
Hartford,
was, correct?
right. Yeah, which of course is some great police work in this case. And one of the things I compliment the officers there is they recognized very quickly that this was likely to be a homicide. They knew she just dropped off the kids, didn't make sense, was not in her, life pattern victimology. And so they were able to get a lot of very good evidence, including that incredibly damning evidence of seeing Fotis and his girlfriend Michelle Draconis dropping stuff off in Hartford, which is some distance from where they lived or where they would be. Of course, Fotis is driving a truck that's not his; it belongs to a coworker. He's also later caught on film himself riding his bicycle near his ex's house, which is very suspicious, wearing all black, and I think she disappeared in May, if I'm not mistaken. So they were able to get this evidence very quickly and very quickly hone in on him as a suspect, which of course he was an obvious suspect because they were estranged. They were having a very bitter divorce. I read something like they had each filed like 100 motions in a divorce case, which I'm not a family law attorney, but that seemed incredibly high in a divorce case to each have filed 100 motions. There was a lot of money to be dealt with and fought over. But getting that evidence very, very quickly really helped the case because it's incredibly damning to say, we see you dumping something out. And then when we go there and we were able to timely pull it out of the garbage and find it, it's got Jennifer's blood on it. All of that is incredibly damning. And I'm sure a reason why he killed himself. He wrote this BS note that, he was innocent and all that. But I think he knew there was no way he was going to get away with this, given the evidence against him.
Yeah, the investigators did an unbelievable job because we're talking, I think, about half hour, 45 minutes from the actual where they lived, right? You're going to
Yes.
Hartford. So even to be able to be attuned, right? I'm assuming, license plate readers and all those other things. But what I was really impressed with, because it didn't even dawn on me. And when I have to write the fifth edition of my book, I'm gonna add this case into it because it's unbelievable. The school bus cameras.
Yes.
Wow.
Who knew? And I said the same thing. I actually added that to my training that I do very recently because someone told me about a case they had. And I thought the same thing. Like, God, who knew? The cameras are usually, typically inside, facing back into the bus, but also outside. And I guess I'm told they're for liability reasons so that if someone hits the bus or the bus hits somebody, they have a record of what it is. But incredible evidence to pull off of a bus is really just a new, and you mentioned it earlier with surveillance cameras and ring cameras right now. I mean, I
Yep.
got one on my house. Everybody in the neighborhood's got them, right? They're incredible way to get evidence in a way that literally ring cameras probably didn't exist, 10, 15 years ago. And now everybody's got them and they're, doing a great job of showing everything that happens on the block.
Yeah, I think Ring though just made it more difficult for law enforcement. So
Oh, really? I didn't know
yeah, they
that.
just made it. Yeah, you take a look at that. I just saw something come across the wire a couple of days ago. Not that it's impossible, but
Right.
like everything else, you're gonna have to go through the subpoenas and the warrant issues. Like they just don't want you to hand over. Even if it's your own, don't hand it over. They want you to go through the process. Life,
Yeah.
love. Thank you for gifting the membership. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
And it's interesting, Joe, that you mentioned that because that has been another shift I've seen over the last few years is a lot of the social media companies that often were super cooperative with law enforcement because we as a nation are more rightly concerned about privacy of all the things we're putting on social media, which is understandable. But the companies have, as a result of that, been much more reluctant to voluntarily share things because they'd rather advertise strong privacy protection for people using their product, Apple phones, all the phones, all the apps, rather than saying the rare time they have to cooperate with law enforcement that leads to, a killer. And as a law enforcement person, that's bad for me because I think, ugh, I really want to be able to get this stuff. But I understand that that's the exception, not the rule. Most of the time, they want to be able to say to their customer, hey, we keep your stuff private. And that is important to most people, except for the rare time when it did witness something and there is something on there that law enforcement needs to get.
Right. Well, it's important that a law enforcement does this quicker now because if the homeowner has it, because you could just download it. I have Ring too. You could
Yes,
just download it and make it a short video file, and then it's yours. You could give it to whomever you want. But
absolutely.
it's like I think it's from after the date, after the 30 days, everything goes to the company,
Yes,
and
that's a good
and
point.
therein lies and therein lies the problem and the issues that you come down to. Because listen, we've seen like I said, a lot of privacy things. I try to explain to people when you're out in public, you have no right to privacy, but some people doesn't equate to anything. Like, well, no, what do you mean I don't have any right to privacy? You don't. All
Right.
right, you just don't. And your
Yep.
car is only semi-private to boot too. So
That's true.
yeah, but hey, listen, what do we know, right? So yeah, so the issue that comes down to is that there's been a number of these cases recently, and some of them, like I said, so this Brian Walsh case, I'm sure you're going to be on top of. We're going to see you on the news, right? You do your court TV and your law and crime, to seek out. We know why now because this hour just flew by. I can't
Oh,
believe it.
good.
So this is good. But the last 2 minutes we have left, is there anything that I left out that you think you'd want to include at some of the things that are happening with these nobody cases?
No, one of the things I've noticed, I think, Sarge, is the time frame between missing, arrest, and trial has shrunk incredibly. Years ago, when I first started looking at this, there were still some states that said you got to wait 7 years, right? Which is really more of an insurance thing. There are a lot of insurance companies that say if someone goes missing, you got to wait 7 years before insurance will give the life insurance, and that's always been a life insurance thing. That hasn't been an element of a prosecution, but it was a handy way for prosecutors and investigators to say, yeah, we're not really going to look at the case till it's been 7 years. Everybody knows at that point they're unlikely to come back. That has really changed, and I've noticed there are so many cases now where it can be less than a year: missing, arrest, conviction. if you had told me that 10 years ago, I would have said, that's crazy. There's no way. And the reason for that, I think, is what I touched on earlier in the show. It's so easy now to show, hey, they're not missing, they're dead, because there is no indication of life from a multiple of things that we can show you that they used to do, that they did a month ago, a day ago, a week ago. And that's the biggest change now. And I think that's a good thing, because I think it enables people to get closure much more quickly than they used to be able to, because you had to wait these 7 years. That's a big change that I see coming. The other big change, I think, is going to be the forensic evidence. It changes constantly, and the ability to now take some DNA and to build what the person looks like from that DNA is incredible. And of course, the genealogical building up of a family tree that they used in the out in California, the
Golden State.
Golden State Killer. Yeah, I couldn't come up with a Paul Holes case. That ability is really amazing too, and that I think is going to continue to move forward in a really positive way for law enforcement.
Excellent. Well, Tad, I can't thank you enough for joining us today. This was really interesting and topical too, with all these cases going on. So I appreciate your time. If anybody is just joining us now, just make sure you check out the show notes. You can see Tad's website, his book. You can follow him on Twitter, and be able to see exactly what he will be talking about in the news media next. All right, you guys have a great day. Tad, you hang
Great.
out 1 second with me.
Thank
All
you,
right,
Joe.
folks, enjoy the weekend. You're welcome. Thank you. Okay, hang on, Tad.